Okay, so for the second lesson of this week, let's talk about short story genres or what types of short stories there are, what categories they are, how to tell what type of genre a story is, all of those things. Um, First of all, genre is a category or type of short fiction or any type of fiction. Um, Also a type of movie, music, all types of creative art and things have genres. But for our purposes here, of course, we're going to just be talking about the categories or genres of fiction. They're distinguished by specific tropes and characteristics. In other words, you can tell that this is this type because it has this type of character, this type of setting. And we'll talk about all of that as we talk about each individual genre. And some pieces can fall into different genres. Like this could be both fantasy and dystopia. This can be both horror and science fiction. This can be literary, steampunk. I don't know. There's plenty. And we'll talk about the main genres today, but keep in mind that there are always other genres that this is not going to touch on. So why does genre even matter? Octavia Butler, one of our great American authors who is the first black female science fiction writer from the United States, was attracted to the openness of sci-fi. There were no walls, and it was all full of like possibility of exploration and things like that. So often writers will choose a genre because of what they're allowed to do and explore within that genre. And let's go over some. Our first one that you're going to see, that is probably one of the most common ones that you'll read is mainstream fiction as well as literary fiction. Mainstream fiction is just fiction that's written with a broad appeal, filled with situations and emotions that interest large numbers of readers. It's usually written knowing where the market is, what people are reading, what people are into. We'll go through they'll go through spells where everyone's writing dystopian YA or young adult because of the Hunger Games, or this series as well. So now everyone's writing this type of book, things like that. Around October, publishers will start churning out more horror stories, things like this. Um, so mainstream is written with a general audience, so it may fall into the other genres, but it tends to have an idea, it tends to be written not in a deep genre manner so that it can be read and enjoyed by nearly any reader. Literary fiction can also be different genres, but they're usually mainstream, so they usually get paired together. Literary fiction are pieces that are character driven with a focus on the use of language, um, and what the words mean. Often the language can feel very poetic. A lot of books that we pull quotes from and we're like, look at this quote, and isn't it meaningful? Usually that comes from a literary novel. One of my favorites right now that I'm reading that was right here on my desk. I guess I don't have it right here anymore. Oh, here it is this book here, House on the Cerulean Sea. It's also a bit of fantasy and magical realism, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Um, each of those later as we go in the lesson, but it's also written, it's a literary novel in that it's written very much with an emphasis on voice, on language, on the meaning and evocative nature of language. Romance. These are love stories. It can run the risk of being formulaic if it's not written and revised carefully. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl again, uh, boy defeats girl's enemy, and they live happily ever after. That is a trope. Unfortunately, because that is a trope, it can be very formulaic and it can feel like, well, I've read this book before. Um, but if you avoid that formulaic nature and explore it outside of things by changing up the characters, who's the main character? What type of person are they falling in love with? Maybe they wind up single at the end, which is also a fun way, a different way of playing with the trope. Things like that. But they're love stories. It typically focuses on one character who's usually down on their luck, who meets another who changes their life, whether that's a positive change, a negative change, or just a big change. It's completely up to the writer and how it goes. Mystery. These are novels where you're kind of on the edge of your seat trying to figure out who did it. It could be true crime. It could be based on a true story. It could be a detective. It could be solving like Scooby-Doo, who's the ghost and villain in this story, that kind of thing. It may follow a detective or an investigator like Agatha Christie or Sherlock Holmes, or it can follow just everyday people that are trying to figure out what's causing this problem. They usually have a lot of tension. These are written, if they're not first person point of view, then they are written with a third person who is very limited. In other words, they only know what the main character knows, and the reader is kind of discovering what's happening along with the reader, wait, along with the protagonist or the main character. So it can be, these are books that I like much better, stories I like much better on the second read through when I know what's going to happen. But that could just be me. Sci-fi or science fiction, these deal with technology, science, and space. Often it's this idea of it could be utopian, in other words, look in this future and thanks to technology, we don't have to struggle with money or discrimination or whatever, kind of like Star Trek. Or it can talk about the ambivalence or danger around technology and what could happen if we do if you use technology wrong. It can be a warning. Usually involves research into the science, and it's pretty usually scientifically sound, and usually they take place in the future. Um, and it shows the possibilities of what could happen outside of our planet or outside of our limitations with current tech, things like that. Star Trek is our sci-fi. It's our good usual example. Interstellar, things like that. Fantasy. It's like sci-fi, but instead of science to solve problems, it involves magic or other fantastical elements. It takes place in faraway lands. It uses fantastic creatures. There may be unicorns, or there may be dragons, or dangerous monsters. Um, Often it takes place, it's connected to a historical time period, um, but in a way that's not quite what that time period was. So if you think about like Game of Thrones is based on different things that happened in Europe, and usually I think it's around the 1400s, but there's dragons and magic. So there's that element of it. Fantasy and just like sci-fi, fantasy relies heavily on description of setting. Your readers need to know the limitations of this world and what they can and can't do within this world. If it's on a planet, then why are they breathing on that planet? Does that planet have oxygen? Do we developed ways to breathe in non-oxygenated air? Those kinds of things are questions that need to be answered in a sci-fi. If it's fantasy, does this person have powers where they can fly or hold their breath longer? Or how do they communicate with each other? Those kinds of things. Do they have abilities? Then we have horror. These are scary. I'm a big horror person myself. I was named after the Poltergeist movie, so I feel like I have to like horror. Um, but they're a lot of fun. They can be. They're also a little lot really scary. They contain an element of danger. They can be more of a fantasy type of horror, ghosts, monsters, demons, magic, witchcraft, those kinds of things. They can be realistic with slashers or serial killers or other human enemies like Michael Myers, things like that. They can be sci-fi with alien beings or technology gone bad. Um, Things like that. But typically, the main characters have to fight against some sort of evil or outward enemy that's not themselves. Often, they're an allegory of the worst of humanity. Um, we don't believe this or we don't do this, so these things are going to punish us. That kind of thing. These are other ones that need to rely on setting to let us know, is this our world and is this coming into our world? Things like that. What can this thing do? Why are we scared of it? Why is this a threat as opposed to other bad people or whatever? Magical realism. I really enjoy this one. It's heavily focused on reality in real life. It introduces elements of magic or fantasy, but they don't take away from the realistic nature of the story. Wikipedia, who, yeah, it's not always a reliable source, but when it comes to a quick definition of a genre, it's great. Says that it's a style of fiction that presents a realistic view of the world where incorporating magical elements. Often the lines between speculation and reality are blurred. Book I mentioned earlier, House in the Cerulean Sea, is a magical realism novel. And there's also short stories, things like that. And hasn't cerulean C, it follows a social worker. And at first you're like, okay, cool, it's a social worker getting ready to check on it on an orphanage, but then you realize his office is a so it takes care of making sure that magical kids are safe. And the kids that he in this orphanage he has to go see, they all have powers. One we find out is like the Antichrist, but he's not bad. One of them is like a wyvern type character, things like that. But it very much feels like the real world. It's set in London, or a city very much like London, in a very contemporary time period. Um, but there are some fantasy elements there. So this is one of those ways of kind of like blurring the edges, things like that. And often, speaking of what I said earlier, a lot of these will wind up being this genre or that genre or every genre or no genre at all. Um, it just depends on how you want to approach your story and what kind of story you want to get across to your readers. Um, I hope that it at least is a good quick introduction to the genre. And if you have any questions, please let me know.